Welcome to the Commerce Tomorrow podcast, your one stop to learn about the technology that's powering the future of commerce. Here are your hosts, Dirk and Kelly.
Welcome to another episode of the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Dirk Horig.
Hi, everybody.
And today we're really excited to be joined by Daniel Tunkeling. He is a world-class independent consultant, and he had such an interesting background. Thought we'd have him on our show. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Great to be here today.
So you have a pretty remarkable career. Maybe you could give us that story. Besides just the facts on the resume, how did you get to be to the point where you're this highly sought after search consultant out there in Silicon Valley?
Well, thanks. I mean, the story does start with a pair of good schools. I studied computer science and math as an undergrad at MIT, and then doing my PhD at Carnegie Mellon. But I never studied information retrieval or machine learning per se. Maybe the closest that I'd come to it was that when I was a summer intern at IBM, I was looking at semantic networks, which were then being used, you have to imagine this is back in the early 90s, for search problems. But I was really just interested in visualizing the relationships between words and phrases in their various corpora. But then after I finished my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, I didn't really have anything lined up. I did a little bit of .com work in 99. And then I get an email out of the blue from a guy named Steve Papa suggesting that I talk to him about using graphs for some kind of search problem. And frankly, I didn't even understand the email, but I was intrigued. I talked to him. And the next thing I knew, I was joining up with 5 other folks as the founding team of what became Endeca, now Oracle Retail Search. And I really learned everything I know about search on the job. And that was an incredible 10-year experience. I was there from 99 to 2009 as the chief scientist. I basically had to figure out from scratch all sorts of things about search. And because I was new to the problem, I was looking at it a little bit differently than the information retrieval folks. Rather than thinking, how do we figure out the most relevant results and return them? I was thinking more along the lines of how do we have a conversation with users to figure out what they want and tell them where they can go from here in terms of the search experience. And from that, we developed what we called guided navigation, but now would be more known as faceted search. And we went from being a crazy idea to being the leading player for site search at the time in e-commerce. So that was pretty incredible.
And it's actually just one question there, Daniel. So because I think in one other podcast, we also already heard that mentioned. So it is actually true that at that time you invented what today is used basically in every online shop. And as you already mentioned it as faceted search, right? But before that, nobody has done it, correct?
Before that, what you saw were a couple of things in academia, most notably the work of Marty Hurst at Berkeley, and a few other folks touching at the problem. I mean, people had looked at parametric search. People looked at some sort of idea of a back and forth, but nobody was doing this commercially, let alone in e-commerce. So, we could debate when a few people got the same concept independently. If someone gets to be called the inventor, I'll certainly say that we brought the concept to the mainstream. And I'm more than happy to share credit with the other folks who were coming into the same idea at the time in different domains.
Let's take even one step back, because you had a pretty interesting academic background, and you already mentioned at the beginning that it started with 2 really great schools. If you should compare, how was life and studying at 2 of the top technical universities in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s? So how was it at MIT and how was it at Carnegie Mellon, and how would you compare those to each other?
Wow. Well, first off, they're both incredible schools, and it's given that I was an undergraduate at MIT and a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, my experiences were inherently different. That said, both of those were far away from Silicon Valley. I'd grown up in New York myself, so I thought of studying computer science and math as the first steps towards a career in academia. I mean, my mother was a professor of Latin American literature. My father had done a PhD in physics. I didn't really think of the private sector as something that people did. And at MIT, there was certainly a very strong academic bent. When people were going into industry, what that seemed to mean to me was going into finance. And if I didn't go into academia, maybe I could go to Goldman Sachs, for example. Now, at Carnegie Mellon, I was more directly exposed to academic research. I would say that what was very exciting at that point was robotics. I remember even in my first week seeing robots around. Nobody used the term artificial intelligence because that was, we were still in an AI winter. But the Carnegie Mellon was a systems place. It's where a lot of the key operating systems work was going on. I personally was interested in theoretical computer science, more the math side. And perhaps if I'd been a stronger mathematician, I might have ended up going in that direction, looking at combinatorics and really the theoretical aspects of graphs. It turned out that I found that theory was a bit hard, and I ended up doing something a bit more applied with visualization, which turned out to be a nice stepping stone towards going into industry and working on search and information retrieval, which I suppose is a kind of visualization, but a bit more practical.
Yeah, so it sounds like your university studies really set you up for success. That's great to hear. So let's go back to the Endeca days. So you were one of the founders. It sounds like quite a crew, by the way. Lots of ex-Endeca folks have gone on to be very successful entrepreneurs. So it's exciting to hear another success story out of Endeca. But how was the sale to Oracle? Were you around for that, or did you leave before the sale occurred?
I left before. I left in 2009 after 10 years there, and the sale happened about 2 years later. By then, I'd actually gone first to Google New York, where I spent a year, and then to LinkedIn, which involved moving from New York to Mountain View. Made for a fun conversation with my manager at Google when I said I was leaving Google to move to Mountain View. And the sale was unexpected. I had thought that Endeca was doing well, perhaps was on track for an IPO, but it had been 2 years at that point. And to be honest, I was so caught up in my new responsibilities at LinkedIn that I wasn't really keeping track at that point, when I suddenly started getting a flurry of text messages about the acquisition. It was quite exciting. It was the day before I was running a conference at Google on human-computer information retrieval, and here was this life-changing event for me. And all I could say is, I'm busy now. I have to worry about the schedule for these talks in the morning. But certainly, I'm glad I finally caught up with it, because it was incredible.
And probably you had been in a good mood the whole day, right? I assume you still had some significant stock.
Yes, it was certainly a windfall. And as it turned out, I was surrounded by people for whom this was obviously a big piece of technology news. Back then, $1 billion acquisition was considered newsworthy. I'd like to think so, it might even be so today. But I was surrounded by people who worked on this intersection between information retrieval and human-computer interfaces. So all of them were familiar with Endeca, and there was something of a feeling of shared success that this approach to search was seeing such a victory. So it it was a fun moment beyond the financial implications.
Yeah, awesome, and it's a great success story still today. And yeah, we often talk about the time when Endeca was independent, when then it joined forces with Oracle, and it's still out there today, one of the leading products. So it's a remarkable technology. So you said after Google, so from East Coast, you moved to West Coast to start working for LinkedIn. How was it, and what was the role that you jumped in, and what was the motivation to go there?
Well, I'd been a tech lead at Google working on local search, specifically helping map the local search index of local businesses to their associated web pages. Quite a different problem than anything I'd worked on at Endeca. It was fun intellectually, although I missed a lot of things that I had at Endeca, not the least of which was being a bit more connected to users and to the outside world. Then one day out of the blue, a LinkedIn recruiter on LinkedIn naturally reached out to me asking if I wanted to run a data science team. I had never heard the term data science in my life. I was a sheltered East Coast technologist, and the hype hadn't reached that far east yet. But I was intrigued, and the next thing I knew, I was meeting DJ Patil, who would go on to become the chief data scientist of the United States, but at the time was running all of data science at LinkedIn. He met with me in New York, and I left that extremely excited, except for this problem that I knew this would require me to move from New York to California, something I had never entertained doing. I talked to my wife. I said, look, you know how much I like LinkedIn. I've been tracking the company pretty much since it was founded. Was member number 50,000 out of what must be now 500 million. And I was really tempted. And she said, go for it. The next thing I knew, I was interviewing out there to lead the product data science team. And I ended up accepting the offer and moving out here in December of 2010. And I suppose it says how much I'm into the work and the ideas, but I had no idea that it was literally weeks away from filing to go public.
Wow, good timing. I should just follow you around career-wise, and
it was incredibly good timing, and essentially, I feel like that with Endeca was like another lottery ticket. But I'm also glad that I did it for the right reasons. I'd been interested in LinkedIn first because just the idea of this sort of talent marketplace that was taking the notion of people's career and professional reputation out of the drawers of, where their resumes would be stuffed and making it something people could own excited me. But the other aspect was just from a search and discovery perspective. Rather than working on search problems where it's true there would be billions and billions of searches, but each search might have a little bit of value. Suddenly, I might take a few zeros off of the volume of searches, but those searches were changing people's lives, people's careers. That excited me a lot, and in particular, the kind of exploratory search problems, because searching for the name of a restaurant or a sports score, you type it in, you find it, you're done. But trying to hire people or trying to find a job, that's not just you find one thing and you're done. You need to be able to look through the set of possibilities, which brought me back to the kinds of problems that had excited me at Endeca in the first place. So it was an incredible change. And to be fair, I didn't go there to run search, although I figured data science meant something like search. And initially, I was responsible for a team. First, I didn't realize just how illustrious a team. DJ had already built an amazing crew of folks, and I'm proud I was able to add to it. But a team that was looking at recommendations, at looking at the way in which LinkedIn represented people and jobs and the other entities in what they went on to call the economic graph. So that team played a really central role in all of the data-driven aspects of what LinkedIn was doing. But I did fall back in love with search I never really lost it again. So I ended up moving to engineering to run initially a team I built called Query Understanding, and then eventually all of search relevance and quality.
It must be really humbling to think about all of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of careers you've directly impacted through your work at LinkedIn. I know I personally have found work and things through LinkedIn, so that's crazy. Tell us a little bit about Kafka, right? LinkedIn was famous for having built Kafka and then later open sourced it. And I know you were there when that happened and have some understanding of how and why that happened. I'd be really curious to hear the origin story of Kafka and how it's gone on to really change data science and change the way we build applications today.
Yeah, so when I arrived, LinkedIn was already known as something of an open source shop. In fact, one of my interviewers was Jay Krebs, one of the co-inventors of Kafka. And I guess I was feeling a little bit cocky in that I asked him, I see you built this key value store in Voldemort. Why didn't you use Cassandra? And his answer was there was no Cassandra because, of course, so much for my doing my homework. I got the job nonetheless. But LinkedIn had been building a variety of open source technologies to solve its own problems with limited success in getting those adopted outside of LinkedIn. Kafka changed everything. Now, the reason why LinkedIn needed something like Kafka is that a site like LinkedIn is fundamentally a collection of event queues and consumers of those queues. And before Kafka, what ended up happening was a whole bunch of ad hoc work to figure out how to grab all of the event queues, not lose the events, how to route the consumption, and it was driving people crazy. So it's not that Jay and Neha and June set out to build this great open source platform. They were simply building something that would solve a problem they had, and then they realized, that actually had much broader applicability. Now, LinkedIn supported Kafka in a big way. So when I think initially the folks from that crew, even while they were at LinkedIn, pretty clearly became primarily the people building Kafka. But then LinkedIn was an early investor when they decided to spin that work off effectively and create Confluent as a company dedicated to Kafka. And I believe Confluent, if it's not a unicorn by now, is certainly well on its way, because this turned out to be this critical piece of infrastructure that anybody working with massive amounts of data would need. And I find something really nice about it too, in that there were no lack of big data tools, but Kafka affected the need to move data around, to send streams of data around. And it wasn't the only technology in its space, but it was the best solution, and as far as I know, still is.
Talking about events, now this is a little risky bridge in a formulation, but anyway, so after four and a half years at LinkedIn, you decided then to do something else and become an independent consultant. Was there any particular specific reason to do so, or did you say, okay, now after everything I have seen, I want to spread my knowledge with far more than just with one company, or what was the reason for that?
It was a mix of things. I was at LinkedIn for a bit over 4 years, and I still love LinkedIn's mission. I'm still a very active user, and I'd like to say that I contribute to the conversations about how they should build their products, perhaps not always in the form they would like me to. But when I joined LinkedIn, it was a 700 person company. When I left, it was 7,000 people. So in those 4.5 years, the company grew massively. And what that meant was that the way that when I joined, even though I was employee numbers 700 or so, or I suppose much later because people had left, I still felt connected to everyone and everything at the company in a way that reminded me of what it had felt like at Endeca. Let's face it, at Google, I was a little bit late to ever have that feeling among the tens of thousands of people. But when had LinkedIn had grown that much, it became a lot harder to do so. And I was never good at the necessary letting go or detachment to not want to be part of every key strategic decision. So LinkedIn made some decisions that, in my view, made my role in search less interesting. And I decided this is a good point at which to say, they have their path, I have mine. And we left on very amicable terms. In fact, before I left, I helped run the Economic Graph Challenge. That was a sort of data grant for LinkedIn to bring in academics. It was something completely different from the work I'd done in search. But I then decided I wanted to see what else I could do. And also for the first time in my life to see what it would be like to be not, Daniel, chief scientist of Endeca, or Daniel, head of search, LinkedIn, but rather just Daniel, and see what that was like. And initially that was really hard. I wasn't used to not having, a clear role, a virtual business card, if you will, that associated me with a well-known brand that was clearly changing the world in ways I understood. And suddenly it was just me. Now that it's been a few years, it's become the new normal. And I realize what being me is professionally, which is taking this knowledge that I've managed to collect and in many ways socializing it and finding that people have the same kinds of search and discovery and data science problems everywhere, but they're often unfamiliar with the ways that those problems have been solved elsewhere. And frankly, if all I do is spread that knowledge around, I feel like I'm adding some value.
Yeah, and since then you have worked with some very renowned companies, like Flipkart, Pinterest, Yelp, Salesforce, Apple, and many more of those. So, how does your work look like with these companies? Is it always full time? Is it part time? Is it long contract? How does an engagement with you look like?
It's been a wild mix. It's been everything from working a couple of days a week for several months at one company, which still leaves me room to work with others. I've never been full-time for a single company for any length of time, but to doing one-day workshops, or in some cases having retainer arrangements where people can just get a few hours of my time in a month, and it might be more one month, less in other months. I tend to commit to time rather than project deliverables because I'm not going in and building some system for them. I'm trying to enable their teams, and I'm going to places where they'll be able to get leverage from my knowledge. And that leverage might be anything from telling them, here is the right tool to classify queries, to here are better ways of thinking about metrics and evaluation, to helping them with hiring.
Very interesting. So I want to drill down on core search just a little bit, as I don't think there's anybody more knowledgeable than you on this. If I look at my own search habits and the search habits of my family, we were trained by those Endeca-style search engines to formulate very specific queries. And in the past, you would go to a search bar and type, large red shirt, right? And now with voice commerce, we are all being trained to be much more conversational with search. So how, now that a lot of the inputs are voice, I heard that more than 50% of Google searches are now voice-based. Those queries are different. How are they different, and what are the implications for the back-end search engines?
So voice is wild, right? We went from the notion in the information retrieval community that a search would be something like a very long form question that they call topics in that community, to typing 2 words in a search box, to folks, particularly in commerce search, encouraging the use of the left rail to refine your searches, to losing that left rail on mobile and being lucky if we had a candy bar for that, to relying more on autocomplete so that we would be able to just type a few characters. And now voice. Now, voice, in some respects, feels like it takes us back full circle to these long form, as you said, conversational style queries. And that's a problem for search engines that are used to saying, I'm going to look at every word in your search query and try to match every single one of them. If I don't find that, maybe I'll drop a few using something like TF-IDF or some other specificity. This just breaks down. If you're going to use voice, query understanding becomes critical. And as we can see, that's been the domain in which Google, Amazon, Apple, Salesforce, those are the main ones at this point, at least in the United States, are competing for quality. But that's not the only problem. There are a couple of things that we're losing from desktop and mobile search that people don't even realize. One is that autocomplete, that guidance. You don't get early feedback that helps you formulate your search anymore if you're using voice. You pretty much have the latency of waiting until first the machine hopefully has recognized what you've said and then responds to it. Now, the other thing is that if the response is itself voice, then you don't have a result set you can scan. We're increasingly getting what would be called a direct answer experience. And in something like commerce, this is devastating. I mean, it's the reason why when Amazon initially released the Echo, Bezos himself said, well, this will really be for reordering. Then the Echo Show with a screen, at least in principle, would allow you to have an interaction with it. Although I will say that they've got a long ways to go before that interaction feels anything like a conversation. So these are very early days for using voice for anything other than direct answers. So it's sort of, I ask a question, you give me an answer, and we're done. Though to be fair, that paradigm works extremely well for a lot of things that people do use Google for in web search. Anything from asking the weather to sports scores to even factoid questions. So I don't dismiss it, but voice is going to have to be a lot more than that before we can use it for any task that requires a sequence of interactions.
But isn't it pretty important that you also are able to interpret the sender of the message? So because the message itself might not be unique enough. So for example, if you say, Daniel, please order me some nice food, and I say, please order me some nice food, we might mean something completely different. And I only can make the interpretation if I understand what for Daniel is nice food or what for Dirk is nice food. So I assume that it requires a lot more than just to understand and deconstruct the search phrase, but also be even more able to interpret what is the sender actually meaning with what they are saying.
I mean, personalization, which I think is what you're getting at, is an interesting topic. One of the examples that we used to use at Endeca, when people would say, look, it's nice that you have all of these interactions and facets, but I just want ranking. And then somebody would say, look, great. How about this? You get to ask for what you want on this little piece of paper where you write down what you want. You give it to me, you give me your credit card, and you trust me to come back with what you want. Most people would not put much, they'd only do that with a very strict credit limit, to say the least, right? Nobody would trust a person, let alone a machine, to know exactly what they want when their query allows for any reasonable amount of ambiguity, let alone something like nice food or a nice car for that matter. So that doesn't mean that there is no space for that. If I know, for example, that you're vegetarian, I probably won't recommend a nice steakhouse. But recommendations are just that. They're better priors, they're better guesses. But even if you, for example, say, I want yogurt, and I know that your favorite brand is Yoplait, I'm not going to automatically put Yoplait, unless you're saying I want to reorder it, but I will still give you the possibility that maybe that's not the brand that you want this week. And that's a fairly narrow example of this. Also, it's true that I might recognize your voice but perhaps you're ordering something for your wife, in which case I wouldn't want to assume that the order is for you. So any personalization, any inferences that are made, because they're unlikely to be made with 100% or anywhere near 100% confidence, they still require some kind of a clarification dialogue, some way of going back and forth.
Interesting. So what are some big trends you're seeing? So let's step back a little bit. What should we see in the next couple of years?
Well, it's funny that a few years ago, people said everything is moving to mobile. And now most people would say everything has moved to mobile. But search isn't all the way there yet. Search is, and I imagine you folks know this just as well as I do from the people that you work with, that search is still, compared to other interactions with the internet, disproportionately on desktop, particularly when it comes to search that involves buying things. And there are a variety of reasons for that, not the least of which is that payment is still not completely where it needs to be on mobile. But part of it is that the interfaces for search on desktop are still much easier to use than on mobile, because search has relied on the ability to scan large screens of results, to use affordances like a left rail to refine. So mobile search is not where it needs to be yet. So I think that even over the next few years, we're still going to see some of that movement from desktop to mobile continue, simply because mobile is where people are at, and search in that respect is still a little bit legacy by having so much of its footprint on desktop. But then you talk about voice, and certainly the smart speakers have been an extraordinary success. And I'll say a surprising one to me, both because people at least say they're concerned about privacy, and frankly, they're not usually great speakers from an audio perspective, and yet people are happy to listen to music on them. So clearly, people love this convenience of being able to talk to these machines in their homes, hands-free. They're obviously also doing this in their cars. And they're not using those speakers much for search, but it is inevitable that they will. So, as you said, voice search is already growing in its use for Google. I don't know if the 50% stat that you cite is accurate, but I've certainly heard over 30. And what people do on Google, they'll expect to do elsewhere. So we will have to have effective voice search. And in order to have effective voice search, we'll either have to have ubiquitous screens, and that strikes me as unlikely. I mean, they'll be on our phones, but I don't see the screens on speakers being the default, because after all, part of the value of a speaker is you can be anywhere in the room and use it, and it can hear you, but you can't necessarily see it, at least not well enough to take advantage of the screen. So that means we're going to have effective search experiences where it's voice in and voice out, which means we'll have to solve all of these interaction problems. And I do think that's going to happen a fair amount in the next few years, and we'll see that with our speakers. In the case of using things like our screens, like the places where we watch media, we will have that and already have that in a more voice to screen oriented environment, but also in hands-free environments like our cars.
Yeah, fascinating. It sounds like you have decades worth of work ahead of you. So good job security, right?
Yeah, I it's funny that between the work I do and the stuff that I post online, I feel like I'm continuing to try to share everything I know so that so I don't need to do it anymore. But it's clear that search has at least as much ahead of it now as it seemed to when I entered the field. And I think that's partly the evolution of devices and people's expectations going up. But search is just one of these fundamental problems. We want things. We have to communicate them. Machines have to understand us, and they have to figure out how to manage the various trade-offs in matching that understanding to what they have. And then on top of all this, it's usually embedded inside some kind of marketplace, sometimes a 2 or even 3-sided marketplace, where you have competing interests and fun signals to work with. And then you bring on top of that things like personalization and various subjective elements that make this just a wonderfully thorny problem with trillions of dollars at stake.
Yeah. We see machine learning based search everywhere, right? And there are vendors out there like Twiggle, for example. We were at Shop Talk a couple weeks ago, and it seemed like every other booth was somebody selling a machine learning layer on top of a commercial search platform, or just a machine learning based search engine itself. Based on current technology, is that more hype? Is it what we've always done, and now there's this cool new term that everybody's using, or where are we with the state of technology?
So machine learning is very real, and is specifically very real in search. Even when I was at Endeca, we were using machine learning for ways of analyzing either the documents or products coming in, or to some extent the queries themselves, for the purpose of understanding them. That's actually not the main use you see for machine learning these days. The main use you see, specifically in search, the main use is what the search folks, for whatever reason, decided to call learning to rank, but I think is more aptly called machine learned ranking, where the scoring function for results is trained as a machine learning model. And that's been in the information retrieval literature for quite a while, and in production use for quite a while, where you can get your machine learning ranking plugins in Solr or Elastic, and certainly any commercial provider at this point is likely to use them. Now, this is the ranking piece. I actually think the query understanding and document or product understanding pieces are more exciting. They can happen offline, and they also can you can make bolder bets on them, because if you think about it, ranking always has a bit of a subjective component to it, but deciding what a document or product description is about versus and also deciding what a query is about is a comparatively objective problem. It should be, those aboutnesses should be the same no matter who's searching. But back to the example of finding me nice food, nice is not something that you could just tag on a document or tag on or turn into an objective meaning in the search itself. So machine learning has value in all these places. And the wonderful thing about search is that machine learning doesn't just need data. It needs labeled data. It needs data where you have an example and then some kind of feedback that says, this is a good example or a bad example, or I have a bunch of labels and this is the appropriate label for this example. Search generates just a huge volume of implicitly labeled data from behavior, from people's clicks, from people's conversions, in general, from people's actions. You can also use crowds to obtain explicit judgments, but with search, you get a lot, in some sense, for free, just from the fact that if you have a search product and people are using it, you are getting a stream of these implicit judgments. So search has always been a natural candidate for machine learning.
Are there any good search products that you would recommend, for example, for a large-scale DIY commerce platform?
So what I see these days are really 3 categories of search consumers. At the most basic, frankly, they need to have search, but they want to invest as little as possible. They just see it as keeping the lights on. And for those people, these managed hosted search solutions are probably fine. And whether they're using a managed instance of Solr or Elastic, or they're using a product like an Algolia, or they're just using the search built into their commerce platform, they don't really care. They just need it to work, and they don't plan on doing much to improve it. I'm being a little bit unfair to those platforms in that they do allow for tuning, but I would say that they're generally optimized for minimum investment to get something to work at all. One level up from that, I would say you see folks who have something of a search team, not a lot of people, but they'd like to be able to really configure what's going on, to change what's in their indexes, to modify the ranking function. They are not planning on committing any changes to any open source repositories, but they're engineers. Those people, I tend to tell that they should be looking at either at a Lucene-based platform, which limits them basically to Solr and Elastic, because those have built pretty much all the basic building blocks that you need, but they're open in a way that you can modify them. And then on top of that, you can look at tools, either open source or proprietary, and particularly proprietary if you want to rely on other people's domain knowledge, to do things like better understand the documents or better understand the queries. I mean, you mentioned Twiggle, where I'm an advisor. They're a great example where the specific knowledge that Twiggle has around retail is something that you can't just get from an open source tool, and it could be a lot of work for you to do yourself as a retailer. And in other domains, you see similar kind of custom-built platforms or custom-built tools that are focused on that sort of knowledge. Now, that the other, you also have folks like Google and Amazon and Facebook and several other companies that are more than happy to build their entire stack from scratch, and they hire massive teams to do so. They can afford to, because even small incremental gains that suit their particular needs justify reinventing the wheel. And hopefully some of them actually contribute back some of what they do into open source.
Very interesting. So what are the major cloud vendors? So AWS and Azure and GCP, they all have a couple different search offerings. How would you categorize those offerings? And I mean, realistically, how good are they?
So I'll admit that I am not as current as I'd like on some of the nuances, but in general, you're choosing between either fully managed search, where you give up a lot of flexibility. You can't just put in your own plugins. They may have issues around multi-tenancy, but this is like in my first category, where I just want to say, point at my repository, ingest this JSON and pop up a reasonable looking search engine, or at least a REST endpoint that I can point my front end at. And there, I think whether you're using AWS or GCP, you'll be fine. I think that you quickly find that if you want to be able to tweak things, that managed isn't good enough anymore, and you're effectively running either Solr or Elastic on one of these platforms. And then it's just a question as to whether, how much DevOps do you want to do versus let the platforms do. But I'll admit I'm mostly working with folks who do have, for whom search is not just a feature of their offering, but is the core way in which their business operates. So they need, even if they don't think of themselves as brilliant search engineers, although some of them are, but they need to be able to change the way relevance works, to be able to modify the way query rewriting works, or the way documents are represented. And for them, it's really just a question of they're going to be using, as I said, something like a Solr or Elastic, and they might not want to manage the operations, but they have to manage the way the product itself is working. And they'll do that. They'll do this on AWS or GCP or Azure, but they're really just using those as compute platforms.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. With that, we are at the end of our time. So I wanted to thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
And I will post your Twitter handle and your LinkedIn URL in the show notes so our listeners can find out how to contact you. Which do you prefer?
My Twitter and LinkedIn are great. And I also encourage folks to read what I post on Medium, either under my own name or under queryunderstanding.com. Hopefully for folks working on search, that's all useful material.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Take care.